Hey again, guys. Hopefully we won't have to be doing these videos for a whole lot longer, but now that I've gotten some feedback, I'll try to take things a little more slowly, so hopefully you'll have a chance to catch up in your notes. We're going to be talking about isolation and infamy today. That's your heading for the day, isolation and infamy. And the first thing we're going to talk about is why America chose to remain neutral or isolated during the beginnings of World War II, when to us looking back it's blatantly obvious that we should have gotten involved sooner, and it would have saved us a lot of heartache and a lot of military struggle. Kind of Benjamin Franklin's principle of a stitch in time saves nine. As in, if you sew something that's ripped sooner rather than later, you usually have fewer stitches. So same thing here. If we would have attacked sooner rather than later, we may have saved a lot of lives. Maybe not, but it seems like that would have been the case. But anyway, so what made America stay neutral in World War II, particularly in the beginnings, because obviously we get involved later. In the beginnings of World War II, the first thing is America's isolationist foreign policy. So what does that mean? Well, on paper, at least, it meant America stayed out of the affairs of other countries. After World War I, we had, on paper, an isolationist policy, which basically, we stay away from your politics, you stay away from our politics. In reality, I'm just going to say this is a myth. Not true at all. In fact, during our isolationist period, we were more involved in foreign policy than we were at many other times in our history. In fact, possibly more than any other time in our history. We're involved with the League of Nations. We try to bypass the League of Nations, and we have things like, you don't need to put these in your notes, but the Washington Naval Conference, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, among other things. But anyway, one reason is that we want to stay, on paper anyway, isolationists. So we stay out of other people's business, they stay out of ours. The second thing that keeps us from getting involved in the war is we already have a massive war debt problem from World War I. So we had loaned out billions of dollars, around $22 billion to different European countries. And also, Germany owed reparations to us and other European countries. Quite frankly, they owed reparations to us at least around $30 billion, possibly as high as $50 billion. So we have money coming to us that is still actually is not being paid back. I remember, if we remember talking about the circular loans, where we loan money out to Germany, and then Germany uses that to pay our European neighbors, and then they use that to pay us. So we're not getting any of it back. So first of all, the whole isolationist policy thing. Second is the war debt problem, because we already have enough debt, and we really don't want to increase the national debt. Believe it or not, before FDR, it wasn't very common to exponentially raise the national debt. We're talking, we have a federal budget before World War I. We have a federal budget in the tens of billions of dollars, low tens, right around 20 or under $billion. And when we get to the height of World War II, we're going to see a federal budget of $141 billion a year. But before this, the plan was don't raise the debt. So anyway, those are two things, and the third is the Great Depression. We're struggling enough as it is already to feed our own people. We have unprecedented levels of unemployment. We have exceptional numbers of people that are in bread lines. People are on relief. We're struggling to keep our own country together. So really, how can we justify, this is what the people in America are saying, how can we justify getting ourselves involved in another war when things are so bad at home already? However, it's ironic that the war is largely what pulled us out of the Depression. So anyway, despite all these things, there is at least a lot of sympathy for the people in Europe, for the French and the British, and I mean really for the people that have been taken over, for the Polish and the Austrians as well. And I don't want to forget about Czechoslovakia, but Americans didn't have as much sympathy for them as they had for the British and for the French. But anyway, we had some sympathy with them, but as a country we're saying, we feel bad for you, but we're not going to get involved. And quite frankly, another thing is we as a country, a lot of Americans believe that the French line that they had built up along the Rhine River to stop Germany from entering, we thought that it was going to hold. There would be no problems with the French stopping the Germans. Well, we all know how that turned out. But initially, those are many of the reasons why we stayed out of the war. Now, obviously, we're going to see what gets us into the war, and you all should know Pearl Harbor is initially what gets us into the war. Sorry if it's a spoiler. But anyway, these are the three reasons that end up keeping us out of the war. Our isolationist policy, the war debt from World War I, and the Great Depression. Okay, now the subheading in your book is nervous neutrality. Nervous neutrality. And this is going to talk about the changes that America makes from, hey, we're not getting involved at all, to we're getting involved. So it's tracing the line, the swing of the pendulum, from no involvement to full involvement. So we had declared neutrality in several different neutrality acts. The Neutrality Act of 1937, which is important, it had said that we're not going to sell arms, like we're not going to sell weapons of any kind to any warring nation. We also passed another Neutrality Act that said we can sell other goods to warring nations that are non-war related, but it's cash and carry only. So you as that nation, you pay cash, you come in your own ship, you pick it up, and then you go home. So in 1939, September of 1939, President Roosevelt calls a special session of Congress, and he wants Congress to revise the Neutrality Act of 1937. So he wants the new Neutrality Act, which is going to be the Neutrality Act of 1939. So you have to have that in your notes, the Neutrality Act of 1939. And what he wants is, because he realizes that the European countries are struggling. So he's going to want Congress to change the Neutrality Act so that those countries that are our allies can come and buy weapons, but only on a cash and carry basis. So we went from no involvement, no selling weapons, to, we'll move over here a little bit. We'll sell weapons to our allies, but you have to pay cash, and you have to pick it up yourself. So this is a big change, because if you think about it, we were saying war is bad. No matter what side you're on, we're not helping you at all, even to sell you weapons. Now, this is, even back here with cash and carry, this is a far cry from where we are today, when we give 20 F-16s to Egypt as their government is possibly leaning more toward an extremist government. But anyway, we won't go there. Now, a lot of isolationists and anti-war propagandists stood against this. They didn't like the idea that we're changing the Neutrality Act. So there is something called the America First Committee, or America First Committees, and they're basically saying peace, 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 no war, and they're protesting governmental involvement at all in this war. And they had a celebrity on their side, and that was Charles Lindbergh. Don't need to know that. This is just for content. But anyway, now once we pass the Neutrality Act of 1939, there's a question about the 1940 election of, is FDR going to be reelected? Is he going to have any problems getting reelected? Are people mad at him for this? Well, to make a long story short, no. He is reelected. There aren't any problems. Yes, he ran opposed, and his opponent, Wendell Willkie, made a decent showing. But the phrase, people think that the reason Americans supported FDR was this phrase, "Don't switch your horses in the middle of the stream." which is basically like, if you're already in a rocky spot, just keep going with what you've got. I don't know if that quite captures it, but at least you need to know, election of 1940, FDR is reelected. Okay, your next subheading is the arsenal of democracy. The arsenal of democracy. And this section is going to talk about, now that FDR is elected again, he has 4 years, and see, the Neutrality Act of 1939 was basically a soft way of helping the Allies without ruining his chances of being reelected. So once he's reelected, he has 4 more years. He has more freedom to do what he wants to do with helping the Allies. So at least for the next 4 years, the Allies are certain of getting some kind of help from FDR. Now, March 11th, 1941, FDR has Congress pass, and they agree to this. It's called the Lend-Lease Act. So before, the Neutrality Act of 1937 said, no weapons, whatever reason, no weapons. 1939 Neutrality Act said, Allies, you can come get weapons, cash and carry only. 1941, the Lend-Lease Act said, no money, bad credit, no problems. It was almost like one of those car commercials where if you were an Allied country, right now they're running out of cash, and they really are having some problems getting shipping. So we're saying, okay, no problem, we'll lend or lease you these military weapons. So they don't have to pay for them now. We're just kind of letting them borrow these tanks, or letting them borrow these bombers or fighters or guns or bullets or grenades, whatever it is, we're letting them borrow them, or we're leasing them. When you lease something, you use it for a little bit of time, like with a car, you put a little bit of mileage on it, you pay a little for wear and tear, and then you turn it in. Well, I don't know how you lease a tank, or how do you lease a bomb? And once it explodes, it's gone, right? So anyway, we passed the Lend-Lease Act, and we become the arsenal of democracy, as FDR calls it. We're supplying the weapons that are going to keep democracy available for the whole world, is FDR's stand on this. Now, we end up lending or leasing nearly $50 billion worth of armaments to these countries. There are 38 of them in World War II. I mean, our books cover the major countries, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, United States, Japan. But there are lots of countries involved. That's why it's called World War, because there are many, many countries involved in these wars, but the major powers send a lot more soldiers than do the other countries, so that's why they get a lot more coverage in the books. But anyway, we send out to 38 different countries $50 billion in equipment through the Lend-Lease Act. And a lot of times we would help protect the supplies, at least by some kind of, whether it's a convoy or something. We tried to make sure shipping lanes were kept open and free from attack. So we went pendulum over here, no weapons, okay, weapons, cash and carry, Lend-Lease, and then you're going to see we get involved in war. Okay, one last thing before we get on to the next video, which is going to be on Pearl Harbor and America's subsequent involvement in World War II. One thing I want to talk about is our involvement in the Atlantic Ocean before we declare war on Germany. So May 1941, you don't have to put the date in your notes, a German submarine attacked and sank an American merchant vessel. And then shortly thereafter, the Greer, which was an American destroyer, you don't need to know that name either, was fired on by a German submarine. And after this happened, FDR gave orders that you shoot on sight any German or Italian vessel. Americans, if you see a German or Italian vessel and they're coming after you, shoot it on sight. Don't ask any questions. Technically, that's a declaration of war. So we're getting really close to war now with Germany and Italy.